right into this explainer. If you've been following the news lately, you know the situation in the Middle East has reached a highly critical juncture. We're looking at this incredibly tense scenario where high-level diplomacy is just crashing head-on into fierce military action on the ground. So today we're going to rely strictly on the recent data, expert reports, and direct source material to unpack this fragile April 2026 ceasefire. Here is our agenda for today. First, the fragile 2026 ceasefire. Then, we'll look at the diplomatic perspective, the civilian perspective, and the global and Indian perspective. Finally, we'll wrap up with predictions and precautions, followed by our conclusion and outlook. Part 1. The fragile 2026 ceasefire. Okay, so on April 16, 2026, the U.S. brokered what was supposed to be this major turning point, a temporary cessation of hostilities. But what's on paper and what's actually happening on the ground are two completely different things. The actual text of the agreement gave Israel the right to act against planned, imminent, or ongoing attacks. And because of that pretty massive loophole, what was announced as a halt to the fighting essentially just became a continuation of the war, just wrapped up in a different name. And things unraveled incredibly fast. On April 16th, the 10-day truce kicks in. Literally the very next day, Iran opens the Strait of Hormuz for commercial vessels, only to slam it right back shut, claiming the U.S. was violating the deal with its naval blockade. Now, they did manage to announce an extension of the ceasefire on April 23rd, but, well, by May 3rd, any illusion of peace was entirely gone. We're talking an intense wave of over 100 Israeli airstrikes in just a 10-minute window, with massive retaliatory Hezbollah rocket fire flying right back. Moving on to Part 2, the diplomatic perspective. So, why the total deadlock? The two sides are fundamentally speaking different languages right now. The US and Israel are pushing a 9-point plan. They want to treat the Lebanon skirmish as a completely separate issue from the wider Iranian conflict. They want to focus heavily on nuclear disarmament, and they plan to maintain the Hormuz blockade. On the flip side, Iran has a 14-point counterproposal. They demand the Lebanon conflict ends as part of a package deal, they want to shelve those nuclear talks for later, and they are demanding the immediate lifting of the US naval blockade. They are just completely talking past each other. And down on the ground in Lebanon, Hezbollah completely rejects the state-led negotiations. This quote from Hezbollah leader Naim Qassem is just incredibly telling. He says the negotiations, quote, do not concern us at all. According to the Alma Research Center, Hezbollah views any Israeli presence south of the Litani River as an absolute green light for continuous attacks. They don't even view the talks between the Lebanese government and Israel as legitimate, which effectively renders diplomacy powerless on the actual battlefield. On the other side of the border, Israel has just approved a massive $118 billion deal for advanced F-35 and F-15 jets. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made their stance crystal clear, stating their pilots can reach anywhere in Iranian skies. This is a massive military procurement under their Shield of Israel plan, ensuring long-term air superiority. It's a very blunt diplomatic signal. Israel is actively preparing for the reality that these negotiations might just collapse. Part 3. The civilian perspective. Let's step away from the war rooms for a second and look at the ground level, because the human toll here is just staggering. We are talking about over 1.2 million people internally displaced within Lebanon. Just try to put that into perspective. That is a massive percentage of an entire country's population suddenly uprooted, creating an absolutely acute crisis for shelter, food, and basic survival. The UNHCR reports on this paint a really desperate picture. Displacement is totally fluid right now. Families are just packing whatever they can into their cars and fleeing with extreme uncertainty. And here's what's truly alarming. Out of those 1.2 million displaced folks, only about 119,000 are actually in formal collective shelters, which are already overcrowded, by the way. That means nearly 1 million people are surviving entirely outside formal systems. They're crashing with relatives, cramming into tiny rented apartments, or sleeping in makeshift setups. Their vulnerability is literally off the charts. Then there's the death toll. The World Health Organization puts the casualties past 2,600 killed. And when you break down the demographic data, a whopping 94% of those casualties are Lebanese citizens. Think about that. The everyday civilian population and infrastructure of Lebanon are the ones bearing the absolute brunt of this regional proxy war. Part 4. The global and Indian perspective. This military standoff is also putting a total stranglehold on global trade. Iran has basically choked off nearly all Gulf shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, while the U.S. enforces its own blockade on Iranian ports. Because this is such a huge threat to global energy supplies, the UK and France have launched an initiative to secure the transit route. And here's where it gets really significant for India. They were specifically invited to join this coalition. For India, a country that relies so heavily on stable energy imports from the Gulf, securing the strait isn't just a political favor, it's an absolute economic necessity. Part 5. Predictions and precautions. So, what happens next? Well, the Alma Research Center predicts Hezbollah is going to stick to a very specific 3-axis strategy. Step 1. Completely reject the current ceasefire format. Step 2. Change the rules of engagement from before the campaign, essentially giving themselves the right to attack any Israeli presence. And Step 3. Systematically undermine the political process between Beirut and Jerusalem. Essentially, Hezbollah views this truce as nothing more than a tactical pause to regroup, not a binding agreement to end the war.
And on the flip side, the Ginsta report drops a pretty harsh warning. They caution that relying solely on the Lebanese armed forces, the LAF, to disarm Hezbollah just hasn't worked. Past data shows the LAF previously arrested only 1% of Hezbollah's fighting force during truces. So their conclusion is stark. If international bodies don't step in to enforce genuine disarmament south of the Litani River, Israel is just going to unilaterally maintain its own military buffer zone inside southern Lebanon.
Finally, Part 6, Conclusion and Outlook. To wrap up this explainer, we really just need to look at the objective reality here. The room for diplomacy is narrowing, and it's narrowing fast. You've got entirely competing demands between those 9-point and 14-point plans. You have civilians trapped in a deadly, fluid displacement crisis, and the U.S. is essentially forced to choose between a quote-unquote bad deal or severe military escalation. The window for a peaceful off-ramp is rapidly slamming shut. So I'll leave you with this final critical question to ponder as we watch Washington and Tehran's next moves. With demands that are this incompatible, and a mounting civilian toll that's literally destabilizing an entire nation, is a permanent settlement actually possible right now? Or, as the data strongly suggests, are we just witnessing a temporary tactical pause before a much wider, far more devastating war erupts? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep your eyes on the facts, and I'll catch you next time.